On November 7, 1972, in one of the largest landslide election victories in American history, Republican Richard Nixon won re-election to a second term as president by defeating his Democratic opponent, George McGovern, with over 60% of the popular vote. It was Richard Nixon's greatest personal triumph. But just 6 months earlier, on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested for a bungled break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Over the next 2 years, this fateful incident would evolve into one of the biggest political scandals in national history, Watergate, a scandal that would ultimately destroy Nixon's presidency. 2 CIA operatives directed the 1972 break-in. E. Howard Hunt, Jr., who specialized in political dirty tricks, had organized the break-in on orders from the Nixon White House. Hunt's partner in this operation was G. Gordon Liddy, who was then working as attorney for Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President. This third-rate burglary, at first dismissed as a political prank, spiraled into a vast political scandal that ultimately led to Richard Nixon's impeachment. Over the entire 2-year course of the sordid Watergate investigation, the secret documents that Nixon feared were held at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel were never revealed. Just what secrets would Nixon be willing to sacrifice his presidency, in fact his entire political career, to keep hidden? At last, perhaps those astounding secrets that link Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, and ultimately the alien reality have been revealed. On June 29, 2015, video producer Daniel List, otherwise known as Dark Journalist, asked former Watergate attorney Douglas Caddy if he would be willing to talk about his own experiences with the Watergate break-in and his friendship with one of the break-in's primary CIA architects, E. Howard Hunt. Caddy agreed, and his insights and revelations about Nixon, Kennedy, and conspiracy politics in general were absolutely stunning. Two years before Watergate in 1970, former CIA super spy E. Howard Hunt was working for Robert R. Mullen Company, a public relations subsidiary of General Foods that was also a front for the CIA. While there, Hunt met attorney Douglas Caddy, and the two men became friends. Caddy insists that at the time he did not know the Mullen public relations firm and Howard Hunt were both CIA assets. One of Hunt's covert assignments in his CIA Mullen work was to head up a political dirty tricks unit for the Nixon White House, the unit that ultimately conducted the burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. Early on June 17, 1972, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, Hunt's 5 henchmen were discovered and arrested by police. E. Howard Hunt then called his attorney friend Douglas Caddy to secure defense for the burglars arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Over the 2-year course of the federal Watergate investigations, E. Howard Hunt was charged with conspiracy and sentenced to serve 33 months at the minimum security federal prison at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. In 1975, just before Hunt departed for prison, he requested a farewell dinner with his friend Douglas Caddy at the Yenching Palace restaurant in Washington, a favorite hangout notorious for political deal-making. As their meal progressed, Caddy pressed Hunt for the true reasons behind the Watergate burglary, suggesting the motive behind the break-in had to do with a rumored prostitution ring that was operated out of the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
And so there's got to be another reason why you went in there. And he hesitated for a moment, and I said yes, and he said, well, there was another reason. And I said, well, what was that? And he said, we believe there were Cuban government reports in the Democratic National Committee that that were connected to the Kennedy assassination,
Uh-huh.
And I said, wow, Cuban government reports that would be connected to the Kennedy assassination that would give us information about the Kennedy assassination. He said yes. And I said, well, what were in those reports? What do you believe were in those reports? Because obviously they did not have a chance to get those reports because they were arrested before they had a chance to do virtually anything. And at that point, he just held up his hands, went like that, and said, "Please, no more questions. No more questions. And so we turned to other. I won't say we kept it light because you can't keep it light with him going to prison, But we did discuss his children and my circumstances and so forth, and so we had a congenial dinner, and then we walked out. And on the street there, I thought, well, this is the last time I see Howard. I'm going to make one more stab, okay?
Yeah.
At seeing if I can get something here, And I said, well, Howard, why was John Kennedy assassinated? What would be in those reports that would be important? And he said, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said, John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. And I was stunned by that. I mean, John Kennedy, our president, Soviets, and I never even heard about such a thing. And he said, and I said, well, what was that? And at that point, he leaned forward and looked right in my eyes, direct in my eyes, and he said, the alien presence. And he reached out and shook my hand and then turned and walked away. And that was the last time I saw Howard Hunt.
Caddy found Hunt's alien presence statement at first puzzling and enigmatic, being a Washington attorney himself and not a UFO researcher. But he sensed what Hunt told him held great significance. His later research would prove him correct. In fact, it would ultimately reveal an intricate spiderweb network of interlocking corporate, military, and intelligence connections forming an invisible supergovernment that secretly dominated the White House and still does to this day. A supergovernment specifically created in 1947 to deal with the alien presence. To briefly review how this breakaway supergovernment came to be, just 2 years after the 1945 Trinity atomic bomb test in New Mexico, something strange fell out of the sky not far from where that first nuclear device was detonated. On July 8, 1947, the United States Army filed a sensational report that a crashed flying saucer was recovered near Roswell, New Mexico. The following day, however, the Army recanted its astounding claim, stating that the debris recovered was nothing more exotic than a lost weather balloon. Just the same, a rash of unidentified flying object reports that year swept the entire country. So in September of 1947, just 2 months following the alleged Roswell saucer crash, President Harry S. Truman signed into law the National Security Act of 1947, which created the National Security Council and America's first peacetime civilian intelligence organization, the CIA, an intelligence agency mandated with no provision for congressional oversight. As well, Truman formed a secret ad hoc committee to specifically investigate the alien presence, known as Majestic 12 or simply MJ-12. The sudden appearance of these UFOs presented a potential military threat that required development of a top priority research effort to investigate, emulate, and if possible, surpass the flight performance of such unidentified aircraft as quickly as possible. And once again, as with the original Manhattan atomic bomb project, this research had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, funded with vast amounts of monies, entirely hidden from any congressional or public scrutiny. Consequently, this operation precipitated the discrete restructuring of the national security establishment, turning it into an autonomous, invisible political state unto itself. Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower, inherited management of this national security state and the alien secrets it protected. But in 1954, the year following his election, it was rumored that Ike himself actually had a face-to-face contact with the aliens. And who at this time was Eisenhower's vice president? Richard Nixon. Little known to most Americans, Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush's father, was top Wall Street financier of Nixon's early political career. The 1946 Nixon congressional campaign was funded by Eastern financial interests, the Bank of America, big private utilities, and the major oil companies. Then again in 1960, the Bushes backed Nixon passionately in his presidential campaign against John F. Kennedy. As president, Nixon would serve the Bush interests, linking Eastern bankers, Texas oil men, and intelligence operatives. As Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon had already established himself as a major political player in the military-industrial complex. In the summer of 1960, while serving as chairman of the 5412 Committee, which oversaw covert activities, Vice President Nixon contacted famed aircraft designer and business tycoon Howard Hughes to arrange the assassination of communist Cuban dictator Fidel Castro without the United States government's fingerprints on it. Howard Hughes agreed. Despite rumors of mental instability, Howard Hughes was in fact a powerful master of multiple defense-related industries and also one of Nixon's secret donors. This Castro operation he delegated to Robert Mayhew, his right-hand man, who sought out assistance of both the Mafia and, of course, the CIA to do the job. And so the plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion, codenamed Operation Zapata, which just happened to be the name of the Bush family's Texas oil company, had been set up under Nixon's directive to Howard Hughes. But in November of 1960, the unthinkable happened. A political novice senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, defeated the seasoned political professional vice president Richard Nixon in the national presidential election. Despite this astounding turn of events, plans for the invasion of Cuba continued within the Defense Department and the CIA without JFK and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, knowing about it. On April 17, 1961, barely 4 months into the Kennedy administration, the fateful invasion was launched, resulting in a colossal failure and embarrassment to both the nation and President Kennedy personally. Thus, the driving motivation behind the Watergate burglary of 1972 was recovery of documents pertaining to this Nixon-Cuban invasion connection. Lawrence O'Brien, then chairman of the Democratic National Committee, had formerly served as Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes. It was Nixon's paranoia that the Democratic Party possession of the Cuban government's report on the Kennedy assassination, if it did exist, and if it were disclosed, would destroy his political career by exposing his complicity in the covert chain of events that ultimately led to John F. Kennedy's murder. But perhaps, as Douglas Caddy suggested, knowledge of the alien presence was Nixon's greatest secret. An anecdotal side note to the Nixon presidency involves popular comedian and television personality Jackie Gleason, who was a staunch supporter of the Republican Party and eventually became good friends with Richard Nixon. Gleason and Nixon would golf together, and according to Gleason, Nixon shared his interest in UFOs, although he didn't like to talk about it. But during a trip to Florida to help support a charity event that Gleason was sponsoring, Nixon decided it was time to reveal the alien presence to his friend. Gleason's wife recounts that her husband Jackie arrived home unusually late on the evening of February 19, 1973. He said he had been to Homestead Air Force Base where he had seen alien bodies. Earlier that evening, Richard Nixon had arrived at Gleason's house alone in his private car and told Gleason that he wanted to show him something. Together they drove to Homestead Air Force Base. The gate security guard, stunned to see the president himself in the car, waved them through. Inside a well-guarded building, Nixon showed Gleason a number of laboratories that led to an inner chamber. Within this chamber were several containers that looked like glass-top freezers. And inside these containers, Gleason saw preserved bodies he thought were mangled children. But upon closer examination, he saw they were not human. He described them as small, only about 2 feet tall, with bald heads. Gleason remained profoundly shaken by this experience for days, disturbed that the government would deliberately keep the alien presence hidden from the public. If authentic, Gleason's tale remained yet another of Nixon's well-guarded secrets. Five years after the Roswell crash, the alien presence still remained a top priority national security issue. In July of 1952, UFOs were buzzing the nation's capital, and Harry Truman was powerless to stop them. In 1954, Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower, allegedly had first-hand meetings with the aliens at Muroc Air Base in California, where he was urged by these entities to cease nuclear weapons development. Ike declined, but instead, by secret executive memorandum NSC 5510, Eisenhower later established MJ-12 as a permanent committee to oversee and conduct all covert activities concerned with the alien presence. A major finding of this study committee was that the public could not be told. It was believed that such disclosure would almost certainly lead to collapse of economic and religious institutions, leading to general social disorder, ending in total anarchy. Secrecy was imperative. As well, Congress could not be told, requiring that funding for alien research projects would have to come from outside the government, from confidential CIA non-appropriated funds. In the final months of World War II, the United States had already seized possession of Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita's Golden Lily war treasure. Tons of stolen gold bullion and other valuable items, scoured from across China and Indochina, hidden in caves north of Manila in the Philippine Islands. President Truman authorized this Japanese plunder to be held as a state secret, a vast wealth of treasure sequestered for an off-the-books covert operations funding reserve. But aside from captured Japanese war loot, MJ-12 decided that a viable means for funding alien research projects was to corner the illegal drug market. The British and French had established historical precedents in the 19th century by exploiting the Far East opium trade to fill their coffers and gain political domination of China and Vietnam, respectively. A young, ambitious member of the Council of Foreign Relations was approached. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush, who at that time was president and CEO of Zapata Oil Company, based in Texas. Zapata Oil was experimenting with a new technology of offshore drilling, oil rigs ideal for drop-off shipments of drugs from South America by fishing boats, which in turn could be discreetly smuggled into the United States. George Bush agreed to help organize this CIA operation, which worked better than anyone had dreamed. Thanks to George Herbert Walker Bush, also known as Poppy, the CIA now controls most of the world's illegal drug markets, which explains the agency's intimate ties to the mafia. During the 1950s, over the course of Richard Nixon's term as vice president, Cold War weapons competition between the United States and Soviet Russia became more deadly. As such, the CIA's non-appropriated funds were put to urgent use, designing a high-altitude spy plane to maintain surveillance of Soviet military potentials. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower authorized CIA Director Allen Dulles to proceed with a crash program to develop a top-secret spy plane to accomplish that mission. A remote area of the Nevada Salt Flats was chosen as the secret test location for the CIA's U-2 spy plane. In 1955, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation initiated its first Black Ops aircraft project at what would eventually become the notorious Area 51, home to numerous Black Project aircraft, some even rumored to be back-engineered from alien UFO designs. Coincidentally, the Lockheed Corporation also manufactured airplanes for Howard Hughes. CIA projects discreetly financed by streamlined procurement, off-the-books contingency funds were managed by Richard Bissell, director of the U-2 project, who was later joined in 1961 by Air Force General Charles P. Cabell, who became deputy director of the CIA under Allen Dulles. Together, this Dulles-Bissell-Cabell intelligence nexus of secret bankers was joined by none other than Nelson Rockefeller, who helped privately fund development of the CIA's Corona spy satellite, to introduce a satellite network intended for UFO surveillance as well. Essentially, these men were forming a dynamic interface alliance with national intelligence, military, corporate, and financial interests that were drifting further away from constitutional legality or executive authority. Of course, circumventing constitutional legal authority just happened to be the expertise of Allen Dulles, considering his corporate law background before World War II, when he and his brother John Foster Dulles were liberating major American corporations from government restrictions against investing in Hitler's Third Reich. By 1961, President Eisenhower was so alarmed by the menacing illegal power festering within this military intelligence network that upon leaving office he warned in his farewell television address against the looming danger of the military-industrial complex.
This evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
the energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Less than 1 month after Kennedy's inaugural address, more than 50 UFOs at a high rate of speed and obviously under intelligent control invaded the skies over Europe.
All through the late 50s and early 60s, large numbers of circular metallic objects were flying all over Central Europe. I must tell you that not only were they flying then, but they're still flying today. These objects were circular, they were metallic, they were flying at a very high altitude, in formation, obviously under intelligent control. They would generally fly out of the Soviet sector from the east, over Central Europe, over a divided Germany, over France, southern England, over the southern coast of England. These formations would generally turn north and disappear off of NATO radar over the Norwegian Sea. Now, for a number of years, the Soviets thought those objects belonged to us. And for a time, we thought they actually might belong to the Soviets. Now, their flying over Europe had a number of times almost had we and the Soviets shooting at each other.
According to the testimony of former United States Army Command Sergeant Major Robert O. Dean, who was stationed at NATO headquarters, again on the night of February 2, 1961, roughly 50 of these objects flew over in formation at a high rate of speed, obviously under intelligent control. The Soviets went on red alert. They closed all of the borders in Berlin. We went on red alert. Everybody responded. The teletypes were going off. Phones were all ringing. All hell was breaking loose all over Central Europe. We thought the war had begun. As long as UFOs continued to freely violate the airspace over superpower nations, the threat of accidental nuclear war was a clear and present danger to global survival. By the time of John F. Kennedy's presidency, excessive UFO secrecy in itself had become a threat to national security. Much like his predecessor Dwight Eisenhower, President John F. Kennedy entered office deeply suspicious of the military-industrial complex, and rightly so. Just as Eisenhower warned, the Pentagon and its CIA cronies launched the failed Black Ops Cuban invasion fiasco on April 17, 1961. And just 10 days later, on April 27, 1961, President Kennedy bluntly stated his mistrust of the national security state to the American Newspaper Publishers Association.
Ladies and gentlemen,
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
In June of 1961, President Kennedy took direct action against the CIA's power monopoly when he issued National Security Action Memorandum 55, in which he directed that the Defense Department assume oversight of the CIA's covert activities. Kennedy had launched his own private Cold War with MJ-12 and the military-industrial complex. And just to show he meant business, Kennedy fired the CIA's secret bankers, Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and General Charles Cabell. According to the research of investigative reporter Jim Mars, a controversial MJ-12 document titled Interplanetary Phenomena Unit Summary noted Kennedy's insider knowledge. This document, apparently written soon after the New Mexico UFO crash in July 1947, states, "It has become known to Counterintelligence Corps that some of the recovery operation was shared with Representative John F. Kennedy, Massachusetts Democrat elected to Congress in 1946, son of Joseph P. Kennedy, Commissioner on Organization of the Executive Branch of the Government. Jack Kennedy had limited duty as naval officer assigned to naval intelligence during the war. It is believed that information concerning the Roswell crashes was obtained from a source in Congress who is close to the Secretary of the Air Force. It was suspected that Kennedy was the only congressman who was aware of the truth of the Roswell incidents at that time. Watergate attorney Douglas Caddy's personal research into the alien presence also suggests that well before becoming president, Senator John F. Kennedy was likely aware of the alien presence, perhaps as early as the 1950s. Caddy discovered a cryptic written exchange from Dr. Donald Menzel, member of MJ-12, to Senator John F. Kennedy, who in 1957 served on the Board of Overseers of Harvard University, that stated, "When you get that pending security granted, there are things I want to talk with you about my work with the NSA and these other activities." The significant thing about Dr. Menzel was his membership in Majestic 12, which likely granted him full knowledge of the alien presence. Douglas Caddy also suspected that by reorganizing the CIA and Defense Department, Kennedy was maneuvering to place full knowledge of the alien presence under White House executive control. In the early 60s, the newly established National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, heavily promoted as a strictly civilian agency dedicated to the peaceful exploration of space, was an agency enthusiastically supported by President Kennedy. If any president could have successfully sold the alien presence to the American people, it would have been JFK.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal?
And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
By generating popular support for manned lunar exploration, Kennedy was bringing more pressure to bear on MJ-12 and NASA to disclose the extraterrestrial reality. But the month after Kennedy's stirring mandate to put men on the moon, the world was teetering on the brink of total nuclear war. In October 1962, it was learned that Soviet offensive missiles were being installed on the island of Cuba. Kennedy successfully faced down the Russian challenge, but for 3 harrowing days, both superpowers faced mutual assured destruction. From that point, Kennedy became even more determined to reduce dangerous hostilities between the United States and Soviet Russia. On November 12, 1963, just 10 days before his assassination, JFK issued his fateful National Security Action Memorandum No. 271, ordering the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, James Webb, to initiate a joint space program with the Russians. I would like you to assume personal initiative and control responsibility for the development of a program of substantive cooperation with the Soviet Union in the field of outer space, including the development of specific technological proposals. These proposals should be developed with a view as to their possible discussion with the Soviet Union as a direct outcome of my September 20, 1963 proposal for broad cooperation between the United States and the USSR in outer space, including cooperation in lunar landing programs. Kennedy also filed notice of this NASA directive with the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John McCone, wherein he specifically mentioned his concern to make clear distinction about unknowns in space posing a possible security threat. As I had discussed with you previously, I have instructed James Webb to develop a program with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar exploration. It would be very helpful if you would have the high-threat cases reviewed with the purpose of identification of bona fide as opposed to classified CIA and U.S. Air Force sources. It is important that we make a clear distinction between the knowns and unknowns in the event the Soviets try to mistake our extended cooperation as a cover for intelligence gathering of their defense and space programs. At this point, JFK's maneuvering to challenge MJ-12 became intolerable. Black Ops plans for Kennedy's murder went into motion. Kennedy assassination archivist Robert Wood, physicist and retired aerospace manager, has revealed rare documents that suggest CIA plans for JFK's murder. Dr. Wood, who is the foremost expert in analyzing MJ-12 documents using forensic methods, has concluded these burned documents suspiciously infer an assassination directive. Woods gained access to these documents from a whistleblower who claimed to work for James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, and at the time of Angleton's death claimed he rescued a 9-page memorandum from a fire intended to destroy Angleton's most sensitive MJ-12 files. By November 12, 1963, President John F. Kennedy had won Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's support for joint space missions, as well as sharing classified UFO files. As such, both leaders instructed their respective UFO working groups to share information. Kennedy did this through his top-secret memorandum to the director of the CIA. This memorandum was relayed on to James Jesus Angleton, Chief of CIA Counterintelligence. Angleton controlled access to the most highly classified UFO files in the United States and was in direct communication with MJ-12. Kennedy's request was a direct threat to MJ-12 operations that Angleton was mandated to protect. In case any senior United States official did not cooperate with MJ-12, the directive sanctioned political assassination. It would have been Angleton's responsibility to implement this MJ-12 assassination directive in response to President Kennedy's November 12, 1963 request for the CIA to release classified UFO files to the Soviets. Revealed on one of these partially burned, top-secret MJ-12 documents was a cryptic assassination directive. As you must know, Lancer, JFK's code name, has made some inquiries regarding our activities which we cannot allow. Another scorched document states, Draft Directive regarding Project Environment. When conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet. Wet work is Black Ops slang for murder. Handwritten initials JJA suggest James Jesus Angleton's approval. In his book Behold a Pale Horse, researcher Milton William Cooper briefly summarized JFK's conflict with MJ-12 like this. President Kennedy assured them that if they did not clean up the drug problem, he would. He informed MJ-12 that he intended to reveal the presence of the aliens to the American people, and ordered a plan developed to implement his decision. President Kennedy's decision struck fear into the hearts of those in charge of MJ-12. His assassination was ordered by the MJ-12 Policy Committee, and the order was carried out by agents in Dallas. Some researchers are so bold as to suggest that JFK was on his way to actually make his alien presence disclosure at the Dallas Trade Mart when he was shot in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. Turns. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting.
JFK was dead. CIA Director Allen Dulles, whom Kennedy had fired, was appointed to Lyndon Johnson's assassination inquiry, the Warren Commission. And the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, just happened to be brother to the other CIA administrator Kennedy fired, General Charles P. Cabell. And of course, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, whose Justice Department investigations into organized crime, a threat to MJ-12's secret funding, was gunned down 5 years later. From this point, MJ-12 had completely isolated the government's executive branch from further meddlesome interference in alien presence issues. Not until the 1987 presidency of Ronald Reagan would a chief executive make explicit public reference to extraterrestrials. The ultimate irony of JFK's murder is that 35 years later a joint project of both American and Russian space agencies launched the first cooperative International Space Station into orbit.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
In 1974, Richard Nixon, facing certain impeachment, succumbed to the Watergate scandal and resigned his presidency. His vice president, Gerald Ford, assumed office and swiftly nominated Nelson Rockefeller as new vice president. A Standard Oil tycoon and one of MJ-12's major financial contributors was now in the White House without having been duly elected. The fox was in the henhouse at last. MJ-12 stole the executive driver's seat and has been at the wheel ever since. Having learned their mistakes with JFK, no longer would presidents be elected. Instead, they would be selected appointees of the national security state. American presidents have been reduced to transient custodians of the status quo, whose job is to speak as often as possible of this nation's desire for peace while they act as business agents for the military and their hardware manufacturers. But as the Cold War continued into the 1980s, nuclear weapons hardware remained a source of interest to UFOs. Surveillance and even deliberate tampering by unidentified aircraft at nuclear missile installations still haunted both the United States and Soviet Russia with the potential threat of accidental war. Veteran Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell recently revealed knowledge of such reports from individuals who actually manned missile bases during the 1960s when superpower Cold War tensions were at their peak. I have spoken to many Air Force officers who worked at these silos during the Cold War. They told me UFOs were frequently seen overhead and often disabled their missiles. Other officers from bases on the Pacific coast told me their test missiles were frequently shot down by alien aircraft. There was a lot of activity in those days. The aliens wanted to know about our military capabilities. My own experience talking to people has made it clear the extraterrestrials had been attempting to keep us from going to war and help create peace on Earth. However, such UFO behavior as he described would be considered at least provocative, if not directly threatening, by our defense planners. So in 1983, President Ronald Reagan announced creation of a defense shield over continental America, the Strategic Defense Initiative, coined Star Wars by a skeptical press. And although Reagan publicly emphasized SDI was intended as protection from a Soviet missile attack, was his space-based weapons initiative actually the beginnings of an extended covert Cold War against UFOs?
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Reagan clearly voiced his concern publicly about a potential extraterrestrial threat on multiple occasions. At the United Nations, he said,
"In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?"
But was Reagan's SDI announcement simply mass media PR for a space-based weapons system that had already been operational for decades?
Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace.
Ronald Reagan was succeeded by George Herbert Walker Bush as president, former CIA director, MJ-12 member, and likely custodian of most, if not all, the alien presence secrets since the Eisenhower administration, which Bush steadfastly guarded over the course of his own political career. His successors, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama continued to hold their silence about extraterrestrials, although Bill Clinton did candidly admit there were administrative powers far beyond his presidential control. The official Obama White House response to the alien question has been, "The United States government has no evidence that any life exists outside our planet, or that an extraterrestrial presence has contacted any member of the human race. In addition, there is no credible information to suggest that any evidence is being hidden from the public's eye." But of course, while Obama denies the alien presence, he maintains a war in Afghanistan, a nation which supplies most of the world's illegal opium and MJ-12's #1 cash crop. In 1954, when President Eisenhower allegedly met with aliens at Muroc Air Base in California, British UFO researcher Lord Clancarty claimed an unnamed test pilot was also present at the meeting. That mysterious test pilot may have been none other than Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was far more than just a test pilot. He was an aerospace engineer, a genius aircraft designer and owner of multiple aerospace industries. Hughes' expertise would have been a vital link to back-engineering flying saucer technology. As well, the affinity between Hughes and the Central Intelligence Agency was natural, America's most secretive billionaire and the most secretive part of America's government. In a way, Hughes was kind of a modern-day Leonardo da Vinci, an eccentric genius who pushed to the cutting edge of 20th century technology, whether in early talking movies or in space satellites. Just after his death, Newsweek magazine quoted a top-ranking Washington intelligence official as saying, "Hughes gravitated into areas that other people refused to go into or didn't believe in." By the close of the 1950s, Howard Hughes had become known as a reclusive millionaire, but his business empire had grown so vast and powerful that his influence could not be underestimated. His interests included the Hughes Tool Company, his perennial cash cow in Houston, Texas, RKO Film Company, TWA Airlines, and the Hughes Aircraft and Aerospace Companies, as well as vast real estate holdings. Hughes' government contracts were increasingly entwined with top-secret national defense programs during the Cold War. Spying and covert surveillance were trademarks of Hughes technology. They also caused a certain measure of paranoia within the Hughes empire. In the late 1950s, Hughes enlisted former FBI agent Robert Mayhew to be his second-in-command. Mayhew, who also had ties to the CIA, was Howard Hughes' link to Vice President Nixon's plan to assassinate Fidel Castro. Hughes' aerospace industries were vital components in a vast complex of interlocking industries that privately managed alien technology research for the national security state, while publicly advancing rocket technology for defense and manned space projects. But aside from providing spectacular television news footage, giant rockets were in fact a monstrous waste of energy and certainly no match for the performance of UFOs. Chemical rockets were clumsy, inefficient, and totally impractical for interplanetary exploration. The ultimate secret to space travel was mastery of the unified field, the fundamental fabric of the space-time continuum itself. So once again we find this story winding its way back to notorious Area 51, hidden away in the desert waste of Nevada, where Lockheed Aerospace Company dominates black project aircraft designs. Ben Rich, the father of the stealth fighter bomber and former head of Area 51's Lockheed Skunk Works, confided just before his death in 1995 that the Black Ops Research Group had in fact mastered field propulsion flight systems. Ben Rich boasted, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, But these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. We now have the technology to take ET home. No, it won't take someone's lifetime to do it. We now have the capability to travel to the stars. First, you have to understand that we will not get to the stars using chemical propulsion. Benrich further confided that linear space travel was impractical, but that all points in space-time are connected. Field propulsion systems can transcend linear time, making interstellar space travel a workable practicality. In the span of time from 1947 to 1995, alien technological realities, at first intellectually shattering, had, according to Rich, become workable scientific practicalities to terrestrial engineers. But much like President Eisenhower, in the last months of his physical decline, Rich came to the same realization that the International Corporate Board of Directors, secretly dealing with the alien presence, could represent a bigger danger to United States constitutional authority than the off-world visitors themselves. Noted researcher, author, and disclosure advocate Richard Dolan asks the question, who's really running the show here? At least the human part of it. It's certainly not the President of the United States. It's obvious that there is a power structure behind every president. And it makes sense that the UFO technology issue would become privatized at some point, and the secret clandestine space program would also to a large extent be privatized. It's easier to have something proprietary instead of merely classified if you want to keep a secret, and I think a lot of this has gone into private hands. In other words, the United States Department of Defense personnel do not appear to be the key players in these special access programs. Rather, it's private contractors like Boeing or Lockheed or General Electric and so forth. They really run the show. What we have is, at the classified level, private money that is more likely calling the shots. Returning now to E. Howard Hunt's cryptic admission to attorney Douglas Caddy that John F. Kennedy's murder was to keep secret the alien presence, one must ask, if MJ-12 does not answer to our nation's presidents, just who do they answer to? MJ-12, Majestic 12, Magic 12, even the names of this control group suggest occult overtones. A cabal of a dozen anonymous men who control wealth and technology beyond imagination and wield power far beyond constitutional authority. These men are as mysterious as the aliens they claim to protect, aliens who themselves remain hidden in the shadows. However, if one can infer the nature of these off-world creatures from the chronic skullduggery of the CIA and MJ-12, it would appear that the political preferences of such aliens are decidedly fascist. To quote James Jesus Angleton, "It is inconceivable that a secret arm of the government has to comply with all the overt orders of the government." So to assume MJ-12 answers to no one may be a premature assumption. It could well be that MJ-12 is ultimately an instrument of the aliens themselves, and that off-world intelligences have been the invisible architects of our national politics at least since 1947. And since that time, the Black Ops community, directly involved with the alien presence, has become so far removed from mainstream Americana that it has evolved into a separate, secret, high-tech empire unto itself, an elitist hybrid civilization literally disintegrated from its parent civilization, leaving the rest of unenlightened humanity technologically and politically irrelevant. have been revealed. On June 29, 2015, video producer Daniel List, otherwise known as Dark Journalist, asked former Watergate attorney Douglas Caddy if he would be willing to talk about his own experiences with the Watergate break-in and his friendship with one of the break-in's primary CIA architects, E. Howard Hunt. Caddy agreed, and his insights and revelations about Nixon, Kennedy, and conspiracy politics in general were absolutely stunning. Two years before Watergate in 1970, former CIA super spy E. Howard Hunt was working for Robert R. Mullen Company, a public relations subsidiary of General Foods that was also a front for the CIA. While there, Hunt met attorney Douglas Caddy, and the two men became friends. Caddy insists that at the time he did not know the Mullen public relations firm and Howard Hunt were both CIA assets. One of Hunt's covert assignments in his CIA Mullen work was to head up a political dirty tricks unit for the Nixon White House, the unit that ultimately conducted the burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. Early on June 17, 1972, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, Hunt's 5 henchmen were discovered and arrested by police. E. Howard Hunt then called his attorney friend Douglas Caddy to secure defense for the burglars arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Over the 2-year course of the federal Watergate investigations, E. Howard Hunt was charged with conspiracy and sentenced to serve 33 months at the minimum security federal prison at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. In 1975, just before Hunt departed for prison, he requested a farewell dinner with his friend Douglas Caddy at the Yenching Palace restaurant in Washington, a favorite hangout notorious for political deal-making. As their meal progressed, Caddy pressed Hunt for the true reasons behind the Watergate burglary, suggesting the motive behind the break-in had to do with a rumored prostitution ring that was operated out of the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
And so there's got to be another reason why you went in there. And he hesitated for a moment, and I said yes, and he said, well, there was another reason. And I said, well.
On November 7, 1972, in one of the largest landslide election victories in American history, Republican Richard Nixon won re-election to a second term as president by defeating his Democratic opponent, George McGovern, with over 60% of the popular vote. It was Richard Nixon's greatest personal triumph. But just 6 months earlier, on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested for a bungled break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate. Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Over the next 2 years, this fateful incident would evolve into one of the biggest political scandals in national history, Watergate, a scandal that would ultimately destroy Nixon's presidency. 2 CIA operatives directed the 1972 break-in. E. Howard Hunt, Jr., who specialized in political dirty tricks, had organized the break-in on orders from the Nixon White House. Hunt's partner in this operation was G. Gordon Liddy, who was then working as attorney for Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President. This third-rate burglary, at first dismissed as a political prank, spiraled into a vast political scandal that ultimately led to Richard Nixon's impeachment. Over the entire 2-year course of the sordid Watergate investigation, the secret documents that Nixon feared were held at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel were never revealed. Just what secrets would Nixon be willing to sacrifice his presidency, in fact his entire political career, to keep hidden? At last, perhaps those astounding secrets that link Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, and ultimately the alien reality